What I'm going to tell you today sounds so unbelievable that while listening you might think, this must definitely be the script of an exaggerated political thriller written by Hollywood writers. Now let's imagine together a world in which a single company can overthrow an entire government, where a company that merely trades fruit holds far more power than a national state, where a board of directors in elegant suits decides the fate of a country just by the decisions they make around a table. Sounds like a dystopian fiction, right? But my friends, this is not fiction. Certainly not an exaggeration. This is the very history we lived. For hundreds of years in Latin America, the real balance of power was not between elected presidents and parliaments. It was between those elected presidents and the United Fruit Company. This company was so wealthy, its bureaucratic web stretched so deep, and it was so intertwined with U.S. foreign policy that some countries in Central America saw themselves not as independent homelands, but almost like branches of this company. Throughout history, empires were often built under a flag. But this empire of power was built under a logo. And the strangest, perhaps the most frightening part of this story is this: most of the world never even realized it. Most people thought this was just trade. Welcome to the ROGUENOMİCSS channel. This is where money, power, and history collide, where dusty pages are opened, and trust me, nothing here is as simple as it seems. If you truly want to understand how a banana company influenced multiple governments, tried to control them, manipulated them, and even overthrew them when it got bored, then we have to go back a little, to the late 19th century. We're going to the time when the world began to shrink with steamships and transoceanic telegraph cables. During those years, the banana was a complete novelty for the United States and European markets. Exotic, sweet, cheap, and full of economic potential. But this yellow fruit had a fatal commercial flaw. It spoiled very quickly. A banana had to be cut from its branch, transported from the jungles, cooled, loaded onto a ship, carried across the ocean, unloaded, and placed on store shelves, all within just a few days. This logistical nightmare meant one thing: companies that controlled the supply chain needed not only fertile land, but also massive infrastructure. Ports, railways, warehouses, refrigerated ships, and most importantly, they needed obedient state leaders who would never interfere, never ask, "What are you doing?" And this is where the United Fruit Company, or UFCO, declared mastery over this dark game. Formed in 1899 when several competing producers joined forces, it very quickly turned into a giant. UFCO didn't just operate plantations. It owned one of the largest commercial fleets in the Western Hemisphere. It didn't just ship bananas. It built the railroads that carried those bananas from the jungle to the port. It didn't just export fruit. It controlled entire national economies, which depended entirely on banana taxes and the wages the company paid. In Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, and beyond, UFCO wasn't just an employer. It was a landowner, a monopoly controlling transportation, a dominant political actor, and when necessary, an extended arm of American foreign policy. The world saw this, especially those who had to live in the shadow of this new kind of empire. In 1904, after living in Honduras for a while, American writer O. Henry coined a term to describe this system, whose entire economy and politics were designed by banana trade and the foreign companies behind it. He called it a banana republic. Today we sometimes use this term as a dismissive joke, but back then it was not a joke. It was a painful diagnosis. A banana republic meant a nation whose sovereignty hung by a thread, whose institutions were crushed under foreign pressure, whose future was shaped not by its own people, but by a single export product controlled by foreigners. The term caught on because it was painfully accurate. And as United Fruit grew, more and more countries began to fit this definition so perfectly that the term stopped being a metaphor and became the company's official business model. UFCO mastered this model. Each year the company bought more land, often for bargain bin prices. They purchased millions of acres of prime farmland from governments struggling with cash shortages or from local elites eager to profit from foreign investment. Sometimes the land was fertile, sometimes not. But fertility didn't matter. Ownership did. Because land was leverage. Land was bargaining power. And above all, land was the only way to keep competitors out. Think about it. A nation may have rich soil and thousands of hardworking farmers. But if the only railway to the port is owned by UFCO, no one can get their product to market. Game over. As for the workers, life was simple, predictable, and brutal. Most were born, lived, and died on UFCO land. Houses belonged to the company, hospitals belonged to the company, schools belonged to the company. Even wages were often paid not in real money, but in company scrip. And where was the scrip valid? Only in company-owned stores. Who set the prices? The company, of course. It was a perfect economic trap. They paid your wage, sold you your food, collected your rent, and sent the profits abroad. If vertical integration were an Olympic sport, United Fruit would win gold every year. Building railroads gave UFCO an even deeper network of control. Even today, if you look at a map of Central America, you'll see how strange and illogical the routes of those early railroads were. They twist through the jungles, skipping major cities, avoiding population centers. Why? Because these rails were never meant to serve the people. They existed solely to serve the plantations. Governments ended up with private conveyor belts instead of national infrastructure. And whenever a country tried to regulate these rail lines, UFCO silenced them by reminding them of their debt obligations. Infrastructure turned into influence, and influence became pressure. But friends, the real superpower of these fruit companies didn't come from land or railroads. It came from politics. In countries where elections were fragile, institutions were young, and leaders depended on foreign investment, UFCO learned very quickly how to shape election outcomes. Want a tax exemption? They supported the president who would grant it and financed his campaign. But when political winds turned against the company, UFCO knew it could rely on something far more terrifying than money: the foreign policy of the United States. In the early 20th century, Washington had become obsessed with protecting its commercial interests in Latin America. The famous Monroe Doctrine originally aimed to block European intervention, but over time it turned into this: wherever American economic interests are threatened, U.S. intervention is justified. UFCO mastered the art of packaging corporate struggles as national security issues. A workers' strike? A communist threat? A planned tax increase? A hostile act? Land reform? A threat to American property. This was geopolitical brand management, wrapping profit-driven motives in patriotic packaging. One of the clearest examples happened in Honduras, but the truly historic event began in Guatemala in 1954. And believe me, this story didn't begin with a coup. It began with unused land. United Fruit Company owned hundreds of thousands of acres in Guatemala. But to maintain market dominance, it left most of this land empty, declaring its value as almost worthless to avoid taxes. For President Jacobo Arbenz, elected in 1951 as part of a democratic reform movement, this was a national crisis. The country was drowning in poverty. 90% of the population lived in misery, yet the most fertile land sat idle in the hands of a foreign company. Arbenz proposed a land reform. The plan was simple. Unused land above a certain size would be expropriated, redistributed to local farmers, and the company would be compensated. How much compensation? Here is where history delivered one of its greatest ironies. Arbenz said, "Whatever value you declared in your tax filings, we will pay you that." United Fruit went insane with rage, because for years they had undervalued their land to avoid taxes, and now their own lies were coming back to destroy them. The company shouted, "No, these lands are extremely valuable. But Arben's response was clear. Worthless when paying taxes, priceless when selling? Absolutely not. But UFCO was not an ordinary company. It had friends at the highest levels of U.S. power. U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had once worked in the law firm that represented UFCO. His brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, sat on UFCO's board. With connections this deep, when the company said Arbenz was a threat, Washington heard, "Communism is taking root in the hemisphere." Yet Arbenz was not a communist. He was a nationalist reformer. But in the Cold War, nuance doesn't survive, only fear does. And in 1954, the CIA launched the infamous operation codenamed Success. It was one of the most meticulously engineered psychological warfare campaigns of its time. The CIA formed a small force of exiles, armed them, but the real weapon wasn't bullets, it was radio. They set up radio stations and spread fake news. A massive army is marching on the capital. The people are rising, mass defections in the army, creating a devastating illusion. They bribed officers. In reality, there was no massive rebel army, just a few hundred men. But the psychological impact was catastrophic. Believing his own military had betrayed him, Arbenz was forced to resign. The coup authors placed Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas in power. And what was his first move? Cancel the land reform, return the land to UFCO, shut down unions. And Guatemala fell into a civil war that would last decades and claim over 200,000 lives. For United Fruit, the operation was a success. A foreign government had been overthrown to protect the company's balance sheet. A democracy was sacrificed to secure corporate profitability. In Boston and New Orleans boardrooms, this wasn't called intervention. It was called good business. In Washington, it wasn't corporate lobbying, it was national defense. And that's how a government was toppled. The genius and tragedy of the Banana Republic era was this. Private interests could use a superpower's foreign policy as their personal security apparatus, simply by disguising profit as patriotism. These stories may seem old to you, but they carry a very modern warning. Banana republics are not forgotten footnotes lost in history. The borders, economies, and political traumas that define modern Latin America were shaped in this era. Yet in Western textbooks, these events are often just a footnote. In the U.S., UFCO is remembered as a weird old fruit company. In Latin America, it's remembered as a monster that shattered nations. And its legacy didn't end in the 20th century. My friends, the methods simply evolved. Today, multinational corporations may no longer overthrow governments with private armies. But think about it. Don't they influence politics through supply chains, financial leverage, digital platforms, and data flows? Tech giants shape communication. Energy companies shape geopolitics. The tools changed, but the logic didn't. When market stability depends on cooperative governments, corporations will always have the power to encourage them. We've seen that the story of banana republics isn't really about bananas. It's about those moments when economic power grows faster than political power. When the fate of a nation can be determined in a closed boardroom meeting. When sovereignty becomes a bargaining chip on the negotiation table. This story is a warning written on the sides of export crates. History may not repeat exactly, but incentives, ambitions, and mechanisms always do. If we don't understand how money once moved nations like pawns on a chessboard, we won't see the next move until the game is already over. In 1954, the question was the same as it is today. Who really runs the world? The elected officials who come from the ballot box, or the interest groups that finance them? If what I told you opened a new window in the way you see the world, don't forget to subscribe. History knows all the answers. I'm just showing you where to look. See you in the next video.